Welcome to Uncorking the Issues, pouring clarity into Temecula Valley politics. This podcast discusses political and civic issues. The views expressed are solely those of the host and guests and do not represent any political party, campaign, school district, or government entity. I'm your host, Grape Vine. Today's episode is titled The Ballot Language Trap. We are uncorking a very special vintage of local school board politics. It has notes of transparency, a hint of taxpayer concern, a strong aroma of I support the bond, but only if we word it in a way that helps it lose. Yes, today we are talking about the TVUSD bond language fight. Because apparently repairing roofs, plumbing, electrical systems, portables, HVAC, and aging school facilities was not complicated enough. No, we needed to turn 75 words of ballot language into a full political obstacle. At the center of this episode are three people: Dr. Joseph Komrosky, Jennifer Wiersma, and advisory board member Jack Guerrero. And the question is simple. Were they really fighting for transparency? Or were they trying to stuff the ballot language with wording that sounds neutral, but functions like a flashing red warning sign to voters? Because let's be honest, there is transparency. And then there is transparency with jazz hands. Jennifer Wiersma is giving voters the facts. And then there is putting the scariest sounding words in the smallest possible space and pretending that is just good government. That is what this fight looks like. The advisory committee had two ballot language options. Option one was the cleaner, more traditional language. It talked about safe modern schools, repairing and upgrading aging classrooms, school facilities, science and career technology labs, college and career readiness, math, science, engineering, technology, arts, skilled trades, deteriorating roofs, plumbing, gas, electrical systems, citizen oversight, audits, and local control. In other words, option one told voters what the bond was actually for. Wild concept. Option two added more debt-heavy wording. It included legal interest rates and estimating 30 years. And that is where the wheels started wobbling. Because option two may sound more transparent at first. But when you are writing ballot language, every word matters. Every word pushes another word out. Every word shapes how voters feel. And estimating 30 years does not exactly say, "Hey neighbor, let's repair school plumbing." It says, "Buckle up, taxpayer. This thing may follow you longer than your mortgage, your dishwasher, and possibly your last 3 cars." That is not neutral. That is emotional framing. And if you know Temecula politics, you know exactly how that phrase lands. 30 years. Interest. Debt. Taxes. Nope. That is the anti-bond starter pack. So when Dr. Joseph Komrosky said he would not vote for the bond unless estimated 30 years stayed in the ballot language, that was not just a casual suggestion. That was a hostage note written in municipal bond language. And yes, he dressed it up as transparency. Of course he did. Because nobody says, "I would like to weaken this measure so it limps onto the ballot and gets crushed." That would be too direct. Instead, they say, the voters deserve to know. And voters do deserve to know. Let's be very clear. Voters should know the bond amount. They should know the tax rate. They should know there is interest. They should know the estimated repayment timeline. They should know about oversight. They should know what the money can and cannot be used for. But here is the part Dr. Joseph Komrosky, Jennifer Wiersma, and Jack Guerrero's side of the argument keeps conveniently stepping around. That information can be included in the full ballot materials, the tax rate statement, the analysis, and the voter information guide. The question was not whether voters would know. The question was whether estimated 30 years needed to be shoved into the 75-word ballot question itself. And the experts said, probably not. Actually, stronger than probably not. The municipal advisor warned that if they insisted on including estimated 30 years, it would likely be unfavorable. Legal counsel also advised against that language. A committee member even pointed out that adding extra language after AB 195 could reduce the chances of passing by roughly 11 to 14%. So let's translate that into regular human language. The people who understand bond elections said, "Do not put the scary phrase in the tiny ballot box." And Dr. Joseph Komrosky basically said, "Interesting. Anyway, put the scary phrase in the tiny ballot box." That is not leadership. That is taking expert advice, putting it in a blender, and calling the smoothie transparency. And then there is Jack Guerrero. Jack Guerrero played the role of the reasonable transparency guy. Very polished, very measured. Very, I am just asking questions. But his fingerprints were on option 2. The transcript shows option 2 came after discussion and suggestions by Mr. Guerrero. And option 2 is the language that added the debt-heavy framing. Again, that does not mean Jack Guerrero said, "Let's defeat the bond." But it does mean his preferred approach created the exact kind of language that consultants warned could make the bond harder to pass. So we have to ask, is this really about informing voters? Or is this about making sure the bond walks into the election carrying ankle weights? Because when the advisory committee's majority recommendation is option 1, and option 2 is only offered for discussion, why are we suddenly acting like option 2 is the moral high ground? Why go through the whole advisory committee process, hear from consultants, review examples from other districts, compare successful language, and then say, "Thanks, everyone, but I brought my own political seasoning"? That is not transparency. That is selective listening. And Jennifer Wiersma's role matters too. Jennifer Wiersma was the advisory liaison, and Dr. Joseph Komrosky referenced a video that he and Jennifer Wiersma put out about the bond. Jack Guerrero also referenced conversations with Jen about comparing wording in districts where bonds passed. So this was not happening in a vacuum. This was a political lane, and that lane was clear. Sound open to the bond. Say you support transparency. Insist on language that makes the bond less likely to pass. Then, if it fails, shrug and say, "The voters decided." Convenient, isn't it? Very tidy, very polished, very Temecula school board. And let's talk about Dr. Joseph Komrosky's Harley analogy. Because yes, apparently we needed to compare a school facilities bond to buying a Harley. Dr. Joseph Komrosky said that before buying a Harley, he would want to know the interest and how many years he would be paying. Fine. Great. Wonderful. But TVUSD is not rolling up to the voters saying, "Hop on this motorcycle and sign here." This is not a showroom loan. This is a public facilities bond with required disclosures, voter guides, legal review, tax statements, oversight, audits, and public materials. The Harley analogy is cute, but cute is not the same as relevant. A better analogy would be this. If your house has a leaking roof, bad wiring, failing plumbing, and old air conditioning, do you fix it responsibly? Or do you spend 2 hours arguing that the repair estimate should be printed in a font large enough to scare your spouse out of approving the repairs? Because that is what this felt like. TVUSD has major facility needs. The committee discussed aging classrooms, portables, roofs, gas lines, plumbing, electrical systems, HVAC, safety issues, and modernization. This is not about gold plating the superintendent's office. This is not about luxury recliners in the boardroom. This is about school facilities. But instead of focusing on how to fairly present the need, Dr. Joseph Komrosky, Jennifer Wiersma, and Jack Guerrero's side of the debate turned into a wording war over how much financial warning label energy to cram into the ballot question. And here is the snarky truth. If you want a bond to pass, you do not ignore the consultants who know how bonds pass. That is like hiring a wedding planner and then insisting the reception be held in the DMV parking lot because it feels more transparent. Sure, everyone can see it, but nobody wants to attend. The experts said option 1 was more aligned with successful bond language. They warned option 2 could create problems. They said estimated 30 years was not typical. They said it could be unfavorable. And yet the push continued. At some point, that stops looking like concern and starts looking like strategy. A very familiar strategy. Step 1, say the schools need repairs. Step 2, say voters deserve to vote on bond. Step 3, add ballot language that makes voters nervous. Step 4, watch the bond fail. Step 5, say, well, we tried. Chef's kiss. A perfect recipe for plausible political deniability, and all under the banner of transparency. But let's be clear. Transparency is not the problem. Weaponized transparency is the real problem. Real transparency gives voters the full picture. Weaponized transparency highlights one scary detail without context. Real transparency says, here is the cost, here is the need, here is the timeline, here is the oversight, here the tax rate, here is what happens if we wait. Weaponized transparency says, 30 years, interest, good luck. That is not clarity. That is ballot language with a thumb on the scale. And yes, that is biased. Not because it includes facts. Facts are good. But because it chooses which facts to spotlight in the most politically sensitive space. The ballot question is not a full explanation. It is the headline. And everyone knows headlines shape reactions. If the headline is Safe Modern Schools, voters think about students and facilities. If the headline is Legal Interest Rates, estimated 30 years, voters think about debt and taxes. Same measure, different emotional impact. That is the whole game. And Dr. Joseph Komrosky, Jennifer Wiersma, and Jack Guerrero know this is the whole game. They are not new to politics. They are not wandering into the room asking, what is a ballot? They understand framing. They understand voter psychology. They understand that Temecula is not Los Angeles Unified, where bonds may pass more easily. They understand that conservative voters are already skeptical of taxes. So when they insist on language that consultants say could hurt passage, we are allowed to ask, is this about fairness? Or is this about failure management? Because if the bond fails under option 2, they can say they supported putting it to voters, but they also helped shape the wording that may have scared voters away. That is the political beauty of it. You get to look responsible while quietly making the measure less viable. It is like sending a kid to school with a backpack full of rocks and then saying, well, I supported them walking. Technically true, morally slippery. And let's not forget the advisory committee's actual majority position. They recommended option 1. Option 2 was for discussion. That should matter. Otherwise, why have an advisory committee? Why recruit community members? Why ask people to study the issue? Why involve consultants? Why review legal language? Why compare districts? Why do all that work if the final answer is going to be, thank you for your service, but Dr. Joseph Komrosky has a Harley analogy? That is not how serious governance should work. And voters should notice, because this is not just a bond fight. This is a trust fight. Can Temecula Valley Unified School District leadership follow the process it created? Can board members accept expert advice when it conflicts with their political instincts? Can advisory members distinguish between transparency and sabotage by word choice? Can the board give voters a fair ballot question instead of a preloaded warning label? Those are the real questions. Now, let me say this plainly. A voter can oppose the bond. That is their right. A voter can worry about taxes. That is fair. A voter can want more details. Absolutely. But leaders should not pretend they are helping voters by crafting language that experts warn may tank the measure. That is not voter empowerment. That is political theater with a calculator. And the students are the ones who may pay for the performance. Because if the bond does not pass, the buildings do not magically repair themselves. The portables do not magically become modern classrooms. The roofs do not magically stop aging. The plumbing does not magically become cheaper. The HVAC systems do not magically improve because someone got to say 30 years in bold emotional ink. Delay has a cost. Failure has a cost. And performative transparency has a cost. It is just easier to hide that cost because it does not show up as a line item on the ballot. So here is the pour of clarity. Option 1 gave the bond its best clean shot. Option 2 added language that sounded transparent, but risked biasing voters against the measure. Dr. Joseph Komrosky demanded the risky language. Jack Guerrero helped shape and defend the risky language. Jennifer Wiersma was tied into the political lane around skepticism, messaging, and wording. And the experts? The people hired because they actually know how this works? They warned against it. So when Dr. Joseph Komrosky, Jennifer Wiersma, and Jack Guerrero wrap option 2 in the warm blanket of transparency, voters should check whether there is a political brick hidden inside. Because this may not be about helping voters understand the bond. It may be about helping voters reject it. Quietly, politely, with a legal citation and a smile. That's it for this episode of Uncorking the Issues. I'm Grape Vine, pouring clarity into Temecula Valley politics.